You're even saying how in one of the illustrations you had the movie with Tom Hanks, how he was stranded on an island and the power of relationships and conversation. Because what saved him ultimately was this volleyball, right? And he named it Wilson. And
Because it's a Wilson volleyball.
it's a Wilson
Yeah,
volleyball. But that's another form of God's grace, where
Oh.
he was like at the end of his rope, alone in this island because of our relational makeup and our ability to communicate. That's ultimately what saves him. He has this fictional relationship with the volleyball, and
it literally is his lifeline. Consider this: what researchers tell us about the lack of communication. People who lack strong relationships have 2 to 3 times the risk of early death, regardless of whether they smoke, drink alcoholic beverages, or exercise regularly. It's those relationships that are the lifeblood. And of course, communication is inherent in those relationships. Roald Howe, in a wonderful classic book, The Miracle of Dialogue, says this: dialogue is to love what blood is to the body. When the flow of blood stops, the body dies. So when communication stops between people, that's when you get these fissures between individuals. So I love, as a communication professor, God is constantly giving us ideas of our words and the impact of our words, both negatively and positively. I mentioned a researcher who says, it seems like the brain has been hardwired to receive a compliment in the exact same way we'd receive a cash gift. Think of that, Harry. If I handed you $50, there's no doubt your brain, your hypothalamus, would register positive effect because of that $50. Well, that lead researcher is saying a compliment, the hypothalamus responds exactly the same way as being handed a cash gift. I think that's by design.
I know.
And God knows we're going to need these powerful healing words in today's argument culture.
And better yet, if you're given cash and given a compliment.
Oh, yeah, as you get the cash.
Yes. Yeah. Job well done.
Boom, that's a double bonus right there.
Well, I like how you highlighted Sam Harris, as we know, is an atheist. Yeah. And I love what he says, because I totally resonate with this, especially in our argument culture. This is really what's going on. He said, right, you quote him here, all we have to solve our problems is conversations.
That's right.
It's either conversation or violence. Mm-hmm. And I love that you put it toward the end, because in some ways that's where we are right now. If we're not having conversations, then we have violence, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Literal violence, the storming of the Capitol.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so here's the great thing about the book as well. I would say it's probably a 50-50 split in the book, quoting non-Christians who have insight and highlighting the discovery of a medical invention by a non-Christian. That goes back to the common grace aspect. God is giving these good gifts to both Christians and non-Christians. So it's a great way to compliment your non-Christian neighbor or your non-Christian coworker by saying, no, you guys do phenomenal things. I'm not saying that just Christians do good things. My goodness, we know that's not true. So it's a way to have common ground with people outside the Christian community, saying you have brilliant artists, you have brilliant insights into communication, and we can find the good and the bad.
In fact, I think that's key nowadays, is we have to look, as Christians, try harder to find these non-Christian folks out there who have done good work and commend them for the good work. And then maybe that could be a bridge to the next level of conversations and say, hey, why do you think that's good?
So, Harry, we do something at the Winsome Conviction Project called the Winsome Conviction Podcast. And it was part of the election year. And so we literally flipped a coin between me and my co-host, Dr. Rick Langer. I got President Trump, he got President Biden, and the entire podcast was on positives about each man. And again, you have, right? So you might have a bad disposition towards one of those two individuals, but it's a great exercise to step back and say, but now I'm looking for the positives. So of course we disagree with the Buddha, ultimately, but the Buddha had profound insights into suffering, right? So, and Muhammad, of course, we're going to eventually depart from the teachings of Muhammad. But Peter Kraft, a Catholic apologist, says that there's great truth in what Muhammad says. Now, please hear me, listeners, when I say this. If what Muhammad says is true, it's coming from God. He may not recognize him. Augustine said all truth meets at the top. But within Buddha, can you find, and it takes discernment, it takes work, but can you find the scriptural truths in these men, even though they may not be assigning it to God? We can see that this is God's truth because we know truth via the scriptures. That's common grace. He's given insight to everybody.
I love it. I know you do this a lot in your classes, and it reminded me of that one time, maybe you can recall it because you mentioned it in a lot of your talks, where was it Time Magazine that did a survey of the top influential people, and it wasn't Jesus at the number one spot. And why don't you continue that story? Because I think that's great, and it requires listening. It requires knowing what the author was trying to say to appreciate where he was coming from, right?
So it wasn't Time Magazine.
It wasn't Time.
It was a book called The 100 Most Influential People in Human History by historian Michael Grant. And you got to take your hat off to the guy. He knows he's going to get criticized because he's literally identifying the top 100 and then ranking them 100 to the top. So my students, I take the top 10 list, I scramble it. So they're all there, but I put them in haphazard order. And then I have them rank them. Now, this is going to shock you, Harry.
I know.
But students at the Biblical Institute of Los Angeles put Jesus first.
Wow.
Okay. Wow. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
So then we do almost like David Letterman. You know how he does his top 10?
Yeah.
And on the list is Sulin, the creator of paper, Columbus, Einstein. You get the Apostle Paul. You get Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad, Einstein, Sir Isaac Newton. So then we get to the top three. Okay. Now my students right now, there's the top three are Muhammad, Sir Isaac Newton, Jesus, but they're out of order. So my students are like, I'm going to be really ticked if Jesus gets bronze, right? How does Jesus get bronze? Well, sure enough, Jesus is third.
Okay.
Second is Sir Isaac Newton. Number one is Muhammad. Now, my students just go off because they're like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I said, okay, but do you know what the criteria of the author was? And basically, Harry, what he says is, I think the two most powerful influences in human history are religion and science. Thus, my 1 and 2 will not be two religious people. It won't be two people of science. I'm going to split that, give a nod to both. So Jesus comes in at third. Why? Because he wasn't a military leader. He didn't want to be a political leader. He really limited himself to religion. And Apostle Paul comes in at sixth. So kind of like American Idol, Paul is taking votes away from Jesus. Einstein second because he said he was going to do that, right? It's going to be science and religion or religion and science. So Isaac Newton represents all of science. And then Muhammad comes in because he was a military leader, a political leader, and a religious leader. So then my students are like, hey, am I allowed to say this? But that kind of makes sense. You know what I mean?
Right. It takes eyes to see. Yeah.
And by the way, Sir Isaac Newton, in my chapter called God the Scientist, I take a look at Sir Isaac Newton, who was a devout believer.
Yes.
And wrote more about theology in his letters than he did about science. So that's kind of cool.
You mentioned that here, I think, in the book.
Yeah, because there's this weird claim that you can either be religious or scientific. You can't be both. And boy, I take a sledgehammer to that idea because Sir Isaac Newton was certainly religious. And then take a look at MIT, their science department, which is one of the most advanced. And I have a roll call of people in that department who are devout, not only religious, Harry, but devout Christians.
Yeah.
So apparently they didn't get the memo that a religious person can't be scientific.